I made one great mistake in my life when I signed a letter to President Roosevelt recommending that atom bombs be made. That was a quote from Albert Einstein after the creation of the first atomic weapons, nuclear bombs. So I want to jump back in history here in 1943, Operation Gomorrah, which was the bombing of Hamburg, Germany by the Allies. So between 1 a.m. and 2 a.m., 2,300 tons of bombs were dropped on the city, setting a new world record, including the aerial salvo, where 8,000-pound blockbusters and 4,000-pound cookies, along with over 350,000 incendiary bombs. It was really the incendiary bombs that started the first of the World War II firestorms. It says, sea of flame grew with temperatures quickly rising over 1,000 degrees Celsius. Superheated air rose above the flames, creating a vacuum that sucked in more air and oxygen, thus feeding the rapidly growing inferno. The process accelerated and generated a wind blowing between 120 and 170 miles per hour, stronger than most hurricanes. Trees were uprooted, people were swept away by the gusts. Along with the heat and light, the fire roared. One eyewitness recalled what a sound it was. It was hell. It was hell's fires. And hell, it was not only hot but loud. The firestorm was screaming. The fire seemed to become a living entity, changing course at will, consuming everything in its path, and generating a heat that melted glass, cutlery, and turned bricks to ash. So that's description of a firestorm that was created in World War II. Operation Gomorrah, the bombing of Hamburg. Firestorms can occur in nature as well, and essentially it's the fire generates so much heat and so much pressure that it starts producing its own wind, its own weather system, in this case traveling as if it were a hurricane. So firestorms are real, right? They can happen, and there was more than one created by the Allies and possibly the Germans during World War II and the bombings and the war. So there's a myth. There's a myth we want to jump into, talking about the effects, the survivability of nuclear war if it ever happens, right? Nuclear weapons have been around for 80 years. Unfortunately, they have not been used, right, in the last 80 years, not since they were first used in World War II, at the end of World War II, the bombing of Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The weapons do exist, and we have continued to develop them. We have, our enemies have, other countries have continued to develop the technology to levels that are quite terrifying, right? The big thing that stops nuclear war, obviously, is the devastation, and that ultimately was the intent of the creators of the nuclear weapon, is to produce a weapon so horrible that no one would dare use it, right? And that has created a nuclear stalemate that has existed for quite some time. The idea of mutually assured destruction: if you use your nukes, we'll use our nukes, and everyone will get blown up. So no one's wanted to do that, and hopefully that continues, and no one ever does want to do that. That was the idea behind it, as said from the initial creators, was to create not so much a stalemate, but to show that, hey, these weapons have developed so horribly, it might be better to go into peace. Who would ever want to start a war knowing that these weapons existed? That's not quite what happened, right, as we already know. But there has been this ongoing stalemate for a long time now, for generations. We are seeing, modern, they say fifth generation, whatever you want to call it, warfare. Things more like cyber and other things have come on board that can do a lot of damage without triggering the mutually assured destruction that you might in a full-scale nuclear war. So I want to jump into the myth here, and this is from the Crescent Kearney Nuclear War Survival Skills book. I'm an apocalypse nerd, so I have read through the book. I highly recommend it. It's something to take a look at, add to your collection, read in your free time, right? So the myth is a heavy nuclear attack would set everything on fire, causing firestorms in cities, consuming all of the oxygen, killing everyone in shelters. So the idea is the nuclear explosion generates so much heat, so much fire, that it doesn't matter if you're in a shelter, because there's going to be these firestorms that consume all of the oxygen. And that is a myth, right? So the fact is, no. right? That is not expected to happen. So I'll kind of read into that. On a clear day, thermal pulses, heat radiation from a nuclear explosion, travels at the speed of light. So there is a thermal pulse that is emitted upon detonation that would travel at the speed of light, and it could set fire to flammable objects like old curtains, upholstery, dry grass, over about as large as areas covered by the blast. So the blast is going to be big, and there's this heat that comes in under the blast, and that could set fire to flammable things. But that's not a firestorm, right? Beyond that, the thermal pulse from a nuclear explosion could cause second-degree burns to people exposed to the blast as far as 10 miles away. So even if you're 10 miles away from the blast, the thermal pulse could actually cause second-degree burns, which is why we say if there's a nuclear explosion, you want to get down. You want to cover your face, you want to close your eyes. There's going to be a flash of light that could blind you. Certainly don't want to be exposed to that heat pulse, and possibly laying down, or of course being in shelter or cover being even better, could protect you from that. If the weather was clear and dry, the effects could reach even further. So if there's dry weather, it could be even further, right? That pulse of heat is going to be carried by that dry weather, as opposed to, say, cloudy, rainy, that kind of thing. That's going to dampen the effects. So the idea of a firestorm would be more of a situation where things could light on fire. So we're saying, yes, things could light on fire. It's not going to be the same as 350,000 incendiary bombs that were dropped on Hamburg, right? These are not incendiary bombs. In a major city, if it detonates, you have buildings that are actually going to act as baffles. The heat is not from that type of an explosion enough to turn buildings to ash, right? So in that sense, that the myth of the nuclear weapon firestorm, it's just not true, right? If you were in a shelter, the shelter may protect you, right? And that's the other side of the myth, is because of the firestorm, any oxygen in the shelter would get absorbed, would get burnt up. So it wouldn't matter if you're in, you would get suffocated anyway. And that's not what they expect to happen, right? It might look good in movies. You see the explosion, you see the fires roaring through the cities, which has happened and can happen either through nature or through certain kinds of weaponry that's been developed, but just not this. So, as always, I hope that helps out. Thank you for watching, and we appreciate you.